Well, good morning. I hope it's as sunny where you are as it is here in central London. And welcome to a webinar between the Institute of Export and International Trade, simplyvat.com, and World First on considerations for international businesses. Just a couple of bits of housekeeping before we get into the presentations. There is ample time at the end for questions. In the right hand, in that control panel that you should see on your computer or iPad or whatever you are choosing to view this webinar on, there should be a little tab that says questions. So if you do have any questions on any of the presentations throughout, feel free to type it in there. And as I said, there's ample time at the end for us to put your questions to any of the experts that we have on the line today. I'll take a couple of minutes to introduce you to the experts that we do have. And then obviously I will let Richard, Claire, and myself go through our presentation. So Richard Bartlett is joining us from the Institute of Export. Richard has worked in logistics for over 26 years, running his own forwarding business until 2016, and now running Export Unlocked, which is helping businesses export. An enthusiast for all things to do with world trade, Richard understands the many aspects of both importing and exporting. Using his vast experience, he is now working closely with Santander Bank and Greater Manchester Chamber of Commerce, helping businesses realize their full potential on the international stage. Richard's work has taken him around the world, helping him to gain insights and a strong understanding of how different markets operate. He has lived in Barcelona, Madrid, and Milan, where he gained a wealth of knowledge in trading with international markets. So welcome, Richard. Claire, who is joining us from Simply VAT, is the CEO of simplyvat.com, which was launched in early 2014. To help primarily online retailers trade internationally, successfully and compliantly. Simplyvat.com works closely with the DIT, an Institute of Export, providing expert advice on international VAT issues. Claire has over 20 years experience in the international VAT industry, so we're glad to have her on board as well. And the voice that you are hearing is, my name is Jeremy Thompson-Cook. I am the Chief Economist and Head of Currency Strategy at World First, the UK's premier payments provider. I started my career at HSBC in 2002. With a brief stint in private equity before joining World First in 2007. I am more of a strategist than an economist. It's my job to advise the company's traders and the company's clients on the day-to-day moves in the currency markets, the long-term implications of both tax and spending policy, government policy, and also monetary policy on currencies, and obviously how businesses trading internationally can prepare themselves and protect themselves from the headwinds of doing business around the world. So that's your panel, three of us together to talk to you about what we're going to talk to you about. So here is the agenda: customs and logistics, obviously from Richard; taxes and harmonization from Claire; and what will happen to the pound and how to protect your business from myself. So without further ado, give me 2 seconds. I'll pass the reins over to Richard, and he will take you through the outlook for Brexit through customs and logistics. Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Good morning to everybody. It's actually sunny here as well in Chester, sunny Chester. I'm normally in Manchester, but actually in Chester today. We're going to take you through the Brexit at the moment, as we all know. It's so complicated. We're hearing every day, every night, different things are going to happen. And I've just gone through some questions that you can have a look at, and I'll talk you through them of what I see. I've been running workshops for the Institute of Exports for the last few months. We've done some in Manchester, London, and Scotland next week. So there's lots of questions, and it really could be a minefield. Really, all we say is if you're prepared for any eventuality, you should be okay. I'll just run through some of the questions if it can go. Just a look. There we are. It was asking if there's no deal, what is the impact on trade under the WTO rules? One thing to bear in mind, if people actually on this listen to this webinar, a lot of people will be dealing with WTO rules anyway. If you're dealing outside the EU, you'll have deals with other countries, and bearing in mind, the EU probably accounts for 47% of our trade, and particularly in the north of England, it's actually larger. Listening to Andy Burnham the other day, he said it was around 58%. We hope there's a deal to be made, but obviously if there's not, you have to prepare yourself. And I've just listed a few things here to bear in mind. Obviously, at the moment, which is more complex that people don't realise, is that most of the WTO rules with the UK, a lot of them are EU orientated, because obviously part of the deals that the EU do with the WTO countries is obviously for a wider audience, most countries. We think we would have to be in a position to set up our own trade agreements, and we think even with the EU, we would set up probably, we think, an agreement with the whole of the EU, not individual countries. I think this will happen, but I'm no expert, and unfortunately there's lots of different things happening at the moment. If we did have to go through our own tariffs and WTO, I would see that you would have tariff codes. If people are used to dealing with tariff codes, they'll be implemented here. Obviously, we'll have an agreement with the WTO, with each country or each EU on tariffs. And now I would like to hope, one of the big problems with the WTO is that it can be higher, because obviously there's restrictions in countries to protect their products. The EU shouldn't be as difficult, because obviously we're already dealing in the EU for many years. If there was, obviously you'd have tariffs, and you'd have all the, when you're exporting that, people are used to doing documentation. If people go outside the EU, they have to do EUR1s, you'd have to do this, and you'd have to have it stamped at customs when it goes through the channel. We will see in the short term, I would think, a higher cost, obviously, because it's new to everybody. But I think in the long term, once we get things settled down, we'll start to see a more plateau and things will start to be easier. That's question one. Could there be any benefits? One thing we've learned doing the seminars and doing workshops is that a lot of businesses are actually pretty well prepared. If you're not prepared, I wouldn't worry too much, because it's changing all the time. But the bigger companies, and particularly in Manchester last week where I was, there was a lot of businesses really prepared on the strategy of what will happen if there's a hard Brexit or we do the Chequers deal. 44% of all goods exported to the EU, leaving the customers will add pressure to most exporters and importers with extra costs, as we're obviously fully aware of. But the thing to bear in mind is the EU actually sell as much to us as we sell to them. Actually, there's a deficit of around 11 to 12 billion. And Germany, just to give you an idea, Germany exports in a region, I've just done some figures which I'll just shout over to you if you don't mind. I was doing some when I did the workshop, and I just thought these would come. Germany, actually, we export to Germany around 2.8 billion worth of goods. This was in up to July 2018. And we actually import 5.7 billion from Germany. Probably why you see so many international vehicles on the roads, because now most UK vehicles don't leave the UK, they stay in the UK, and most international vehicles coming in because there's a huge deficit of vehicles coming into the UK with imported goods, and that's why the rates are a lot cheaper when you send out your goods into the EU, because obviously trailers want to get back out and get better rates when they bring it in. So just also Spain is our second biggest exporter into the UK. Followed by Belgium, Holland, France, Italy. They all have a trade deficit where we actually import more than we export. Again, we will see on the short. Another thing to consider, what a lot of companies have done, they've actually started to open, as a precaution, warehouses or using a 3PL logistics, and something that I'm sure the Institute of Exports, we can help you go through this minefield. But what a lot of companies are doing, if you're exporting heavily into the EU, you're worried about what's going to happen. It may be worth talking to your haulier, if they have a warehouse facility that you can store goods and actually ship in the short term, stock it up, and does a short-term sell in the EU, within the EU. That could be a good solution for you, and it's something I've been working on with a couple of clients, and we've set up in Madrid, in Holland. Holland's a good base, because obviously we have VAT differences which could help you. But I think the EU is as worried as we are about a hard Brexit, because I think it's within everybody's interest to do a deal. Again, we think as a short term, we tend to think that obviously there will be cost implicated. There'll be delays, which I'll go into the next question. There will obviously be delays at the ports, because if you can imagine, I did some statistics on this in the last workshop. There is at the moment over 1 million transactions of vehicles coming into the UK and going out. And at the moment, only 1% of them are checked, because obviously there's no customs involved when it's going into the EU. Obviously, if that happens, you'll have the delays at the ports. People have to have the papers, and if you think each vehicle might have 20 different consignments on there for 20 different customers, so there will be delays. But hopefully, these are all the worst scenarios, so it's just preparing yourself in case. And again, speak to your folders in the institute and the chamber and people like us who can help you. Again, short term, we think there'll be a cost, and the long term, we think it'll iron itself out, and the UK will be trading successfully in the next 5 years. So again, the process would be at the moment, if you're exporting into the EU, you'll know it's very quick and easy. You book your goods, you sell your goods to your customer in the EU, they buy your goods, and it's like all you do is send the booking to your shipping company. They collect it on day one and normally delivered by day 4 or 5. Very simple, very easy, very quick turnaround. And imports the same, coming in, you order from your customer, and within 4 to 5 days, you've got your goods on production line, which is great. Leaving the EU would mean vehicles entering and leaving the UK would have to stop, as I've just explained, and they'd have to do checks, they'd have to do customs. I don't think the customs in London are prepared for the scale of this, so I think that could cause a few problems. But again, hopefully, there's a lot of companies, if people are used to exporting into Switzerland, I think you can do things electronically. I'm hoping this will be a process that they'll implement where we'll be able to do electronic transfers and maybe just a few checks. Otherwise, I can see a big car park down at Dover and causing all sorts of problems. If you're just in time deliveries, again, prepare yourself. If there is delays, I remember when we were dealing with countries like Spain, who were not part of the EU many years ago, you always had delays of 1 to 2 days. And just a quick, if anybody watched the news the other day, if people are sending goods to Switzerland or past Switzerland into Italy and places like that, the delays at Switzerland at the moment between 1 and 7 hours delays, or sometimes a day, because just the sheer volume of traffic. That will be the same in Dover. Exactly the same. Dover, Folkestone, Channel Tunnel, you'll have lots and lots of vehicles waiting to be checked and sent through, and it could cause a real problem. So in the short term, we think again it'll be a headache. Hopefully, with all the new systems that the customs are putting in place, we would have a better computerized system where we would log everything on the system, put it through to customs, they'd clear it, and hopefully that wouldn't delay the vehicles, and maybe there wouldn't be as many checks. I've just put a shot here. Obviously, the institute which I'm working for, we're doing many Brexits at the moment and getting people prepared on workshops. And if anybody obviously would like any more information, I've just put it on a fat file. And if anybody would like to ask any questions, I'm trying to be short and sweet, so please excuse me, because otherwise I'll just talk forever. If there's any questions anybody would like to ask afterwards, or questions you'd like to send, I'm more than happy to answer that. Okay, Jeremy?
Excellent. Thanks very much, Richard. A brief précis of exactly what's going to go on with the customs issues, and I think that certainly from speaking to people here in Westminster and journalists and analysts around the city, they seem to think that the customs issue is still the hottest of the Brexit potatoes, and exactly what that really means for the UK economy moving forward. Right, Claire is about to talk to us about the impact of Brexit on taxes and harmonisation. So give me 2 seconds. I'll pass the controls over to her. Claire, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Jeremy. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining the webinar today. I'm going to talk to you about the potential implications of Brexit on VAT-related procedures that's going to affect businesses exporting. I'm not going to be quite as succinct as previously. I've got about 15 slides to go through, and the information I'm going to give you is based on a no deal scenario. The government has now released a technical paper discussing this potential outcome, and at the moment it's all we've got to go on, as everything is still so up in the air. I'm going to be looking at 3 questions today. Oh, here we go. So the key questions I'm going to be covering: in which situation could VAT be collected at the border after Brexit? Is there going to be a change in the VAT rate or the potential for it to be scrapped altogether in the UK after Brexit? And how businesses can prepare for potential tax changes if trading goods cross-border. So again, just to reiterate, the information I'm giving you is going to be based on if the UK is a non-EU country, as the rules are now. So to set the scene, as it is now, the EU single market has been there, has meant there's been really little barriers to trade, with no tariffs, quotas or taxes on trade within the EU. And we've had the luxury of free movement of goods and services, and of course, controversially, people as well. And membership of the EU has also removed non-tariff barriers like regulations on safety products, etc. And this is why there are EU-wide regulations covering a whole host of industries and products, and everything from food standards and the use of chemicals to working hours and health and safety. And the EU has been very much an attempt to create a level playing field and a true single market. So the no-deal scenario would actually mean we leave the EU on the 29th of March next year. There will be no transition period, and this is kind of fundamental to it. So what is this going to mean? What has the government said in their technical notice which they've issued on VAT? So first of all, I'm going to look at the UK and companies importing into the UK to replace. So the VAT rules relating to UK domestic transactions will continue to as they do now. Nothing changes if you're trading inside the UK. However, obviously without a deal, there's going to be changes, specific changes to VAT rules that are going to apply between the UK and the EU. The big bit of news is that HMRC are going to introduce postponed accounting for UK VAT registered businesses on any imports coming into the UK. And this is going to replace paying import VAT at the time of import or soon after. And this rule is going to apply to both imports from EU and non-EU countries. You're still going to have to do your customs declarations, and payment of duties will still be required though. And the government has said that the details on accounting and record keeping requirements, they haven't actually finalised, so they're going to issue that information in due course. Now, what the government's trying to do is obviously mitigate the adverse cash flow impacts that would happen if the import rules were left as they are. The other new policy, which they're going to introduce if there's a no deal, or which will actually probably happen anyway, which is more in line with global thinking rather than the Brexit scenario, is that low value consignment relief is going to be scrapped. And for parcels up to the value of £135, VAT is going to be collected on technology-based solutions, which will require registration. The government say they're going to launch this early next year, but before the 29th of March. So they've probably got a bit of work to do there. Parcels over this value revert to the kind of current rules to do with importing from non-EU countries. So now that's looking at imports into the UK. We're going to look at importing into the EU from the UK, and we're going to look at the VAT treatment, both in terms of goods and services for both businesses and private consumers. We're going to start by looking at what's in place now for business to business. At the moment, if you're a business trading with another VAT registered business in the EU, you as the supplier has no obligation to VAT register in the country where you're making the supply, as the supply is an intra-community exempt supply and is accounted for by the customer under what's known as the reverse charge. You've got to adhere to other reporting requirements such as the EC sales list and things like Intrastat declarations, which you might be familiar with. And the EU has introduced other simplification methods to reduce the burden on businesses, such as triangulation, which is an EU initiative where if you've got 3 parties in 3 different EU countries, triangulation negates the need for the supplier to have multiple VAT registrations. So after Brexit, you'll no longer obviously need to complete EC sales lists. These are very specific to EU regulations. And also Intrastat reporting won't be required. Again, it's EU specific, but you will be required to complete customers declarations. And VAT registered UK businesses supplying goods to EU business will be classed as exports and can be 0 rated, but you do need to retain evidence to prove that goods left, that the goods have left the UK to support the 0 rated supply. So import payments will be due at the EU border when importing goods into the EU. And the government current advice is for businesses to use their own resources to check the relevant import rules in the member states where you are trading. The government has also advised you might want to actually use a freight forwarder, a customs agent, but they do admit in their technical notice that this does come at an extra cost. So now we're going to look at B2C sales of goods in the EU. So currently these are governed by what's known as the EU VAT distance selling rules, and they state that you charge local VAT on any sale, so UK VAT on any sale until you hit set thresholds in the other EU countries. Most countries are set at 35,000 euros, except Germany, Netherlands and Luxembourg, where it's 100,000 euros. So at this point you go over threshold, you have to VAT register there. Another area that really affects B2C sales, especially if you're using the likes of Amazon, fulfillment infrastructure. Currently, if you have your stock in another EU country for onward sale to private consumers, it triggers an immediate need to VAT register there. There are no thresholds, local thresholds to exceed at all. So post-Brexit, UK businesses will be exporting goods to EU private consumers. Now, they're going to scrap the distance selling rules. They will no longer apply. And the UK businesses will again 0 rate any goods to EU customers as they are exports to non-EU customers now. But again, goods entering the EU will enter the same way as now from a non-EU country. So you've got associated input VAT and customs duties due when the goods arrive into the EU. And you have to decide who is the importer of record, whether it's your customer or you as a seller, and that will indicate who has got the VAT liability. And looking at the use of fulfillment centres, and this was mentioned before, so if you actually store goods in another EU country, there is a liability to VAT register in that country to account for the sales on those goods. You've created a taxable supply. But once your stock is sat there, if you're selling B2C to consumers, you can leverage the EU distance selling rules. So you don't have to register in the other EU countries until you hit those set thresholds, which keeps the cost of compliance low. But the kind of sting in the tail here is that fiscal representation may be required. Some countries like France, Poland, Italy, for example, they require a fiscal representative to be in place for non-EU companies. Now, the fiscal rep is jointly and severally liable for any VAT owed, so a bank guarantee is often required, and again, is adding cost to your bottom line. So now moving on to services, selling business to business in the EU. So currently, if you're a supplier of services to EU customers, the reverse charge is applied, which is a EU VAT initiative. So no VAT goes on your invoice, but your invoice must meet compliance criteria, and you must submit an EC sales list for services. And if you're a customer receiving those services, you need to provide your supplier with a valid VAT number. And then that means no VAT is put on the invoice, but you account for it, as I said, under the reverse charge. So after Brexit, practically not much will change. The VAT, place of supply rules, will remain the same for UK businesses, and the customer accounts for the VAT, and the VAT treatment means it's outside the scope of UK VAT. But if you're an EU customer, you don't have to supply your VAT number in order for the reverse charge to apply. It can't be applied to non-EU companies. And I'm just going to touch on digital services selling to private consumers, because there was a big change in 2015 when the VATMOS mini one-stop shop was introduced by the EU, and it meant that VAT on digital services were going to be changed, or to be charged where the customer is resident. So currently, if you're a UK business selling digital services to private consumers, you're going to be filing your VATMOS through HMRC, through your HMRC portal. But post a no Brexit deal, these supplies are going to come under what's known as the non-union VATMOS rules. And a UK business is going to have to register in one EU country that's still in the EU and file via that country, but you can only arrange this after the UK leaves the EU, apparently, or you can register for VAT in every EU country where you make a sale, which is quite burdensome on the compliance resources that you'd have to apply for that. So VATMOS is the way forward. I'm just going to move on to question 2. Will there be a change in the VAT rate or the potential for it to be scrapped altogether in the UK after Brexit? Now, as I've stated, the government has said they will not scrap the VAT system in the UK, and this has been announced in its technical notice for a no-deal Brexit. The VAT rules relating to your UK transactions are going to carry on applying, and I've touched on how the rules are going to change if you're trading to EU customers or vice versa. They are looking obviously at the VAT rate. Now we wouldn't have to go to Brussels to get any reduction in the VAT rate. Before, we had to have negotiations with them about applying zero rated on goods that became known as the tampon tax in 2016. We had to go to Brussels to get their approval. Going forward, after we leave the EU, of course, we don't have to get approval from Brussels. It's thought the standard rate will probably stay as it is. Obviously, there's going to be lost revenue with the implementation of Brexit, and the UK Treasury are going to have to counterbalance that somehow. So we don't think the VAT rate is going to definitely not go down. And the final question, how can businesses prepare for potential tax changes if trading goods cross-border? Now, there's going to be practical steps you have to take, which we've talked through. As you are going to be a non-EU importer, you're going to have to get an EORI number, which identifies you as an importer. Apparently, you can't do this now. There's going to be further information later in the year. And the government has a sign up to EU email updates, and they said they'll be contacting businesses who have registered for this service when the EORI number service becomes available. So that's something to keep an eye out and sign up for. You need to look at your Incoterms with your current suppliers. They need to reflect, now you're an importer, what happens, how's that going to impact you? You need to look at the rules and regulations of the EU countries where you're importing to. What are the local rules? What are the rates? How is it going to affect your margins and impact on your resources? And obviously, how much volume are you doing in the EU? With the changes coming, is it still going to make it a profitable market for you? And if you do want to continue trading with your EU customers or suppliers, is it going to be increased burden on cost? Are you going to need to get credit lines, and where you're going to get this funding from? So those are just, you need to really start thinking about this. And I'm just, I went to a seminar last week with the British Chamber of Commerce, and they've got some, I thought, really useful collateral on their website. They've got a Brexit checklist, which covers different questions that you should be thinking about. And a couple of them I've listed here. For example, how resilient is your supply chain if there are delays to the borders? Are you going to get penalised if there's delays? These all need renegotiating. Are you need to look at storage facilities? How much stock do you keep on hand? And again, the additional funding implications, are you going to have enough cash flow? So they've also got a risk register. They have monthly meetings with the cabinet, and they are putting forward Britain's businesses' concerns, positive and negative, about the impact of Brexit. So they want case studies. They want you guys to get your voice to the government. They've got a list with a risk register of the information they've asked the government for direction on. And at the moment, it's got a traffic light system, and a lot of those haven't been answered, but they keep lobbying and pushing. So it's well worth looking at the collateral and maybe getting in touch with them if you've got something specific you want them to cover. So that's it, a really quite high level view of potentially what you're going to need to think about and how it's going to affect your supply chain in terms of VAT. So thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Claire. A very comprehensive look at VAT. And obviously, it's not just going to be VAT that's going to possibly influence trade over the course of the Brexit time period. And obviously, we'll be looking here at Westminster exactly what happens with other consumer taxes, but also personal income tax, capital gains tax, inheritance tax, all possibly on the slate for changes post the withdrawal period. So thank you very much. My name is Jeremy Thompson-Cook, the Chief Economist here at World First. So I'm going to take you through our outlook for sterling. Sterling is definitely the barometer of Brexit. It seems to be that the only person really supporting Brexit at the moment is Michel Barnier. Anytime he comes out with a speech which talks up the possibility of a deal, sterling rallies. Anytime anybody else talks about something, sterling tends to fall off. So I'll take you through what sterling's done over the course of the year, the influences and the volatility that we've seen. A little timeline of what the major hurdles politically and economically over the course of the next couple of years, what we expect from the announcements, what we expect from politicians, and obviously what can international businesses do. As I've put here, sterling's had a pretty middling year. If there's a green bar on the right-hand side of this chart, sterling has lost that amount in percentage terms against that currency. A red bar shows that sterling has gained against those currencies. So it's gained against Brazilian real and the South African rand, not particularly countries that UK corporates, UK businesses tend to do a huge amount of trade with. We've lost against the euro, but only by about 0.25%. We've lost against the US dollar by around 4%. We're kind of in the middle of the pack. What, of course, has happened, however, is it could have been a lot worse. This is the sterling index, the index of the pound against every currency out there in the world. Obviously, the higher this is, the stronger the pound is as a whole. And at the moment, it's down towards the lowest levels that it's been all year. That peak higher, let me just get something else so I can draw on this chart for you guys. This peak around here was just after the transitional deal was announced. Now, obviously the transitional deal, which allows us to keep access to the single market, access to the customs union, as long as we have a withdrawal agreement in place by March the 29th, has been seen by a lot of our clients here at World First and a lot of businesses who I speak to as roundly good news. But ever since then, people have been talking up the prospect of a no-deal Brexit by March the 29th, 2019, and as a result, the transitional deal would not be applicable, and hence sterling has been falling off as a result. So where do people think we are likely to go with pound over the course of the next, I don't know, let's say a year? Well, the one thing you can always expect with currency markets is for them to not really have a clue. This is a survey of banks and analysts and economists about sterling versus the US dollar over the course of the next 12 months. The high expectation is that we'll get to a level about 145 in that kind of time period. A low expectation is around 125. So that's 20 cents. You know, that's about what's that, a 17% move. So between the high and the low of those two expectations, that's a huge shift in what could possibly happen. Now, obviously, to the high side is a deal which would probably allow us access to the single market on a ongoing and continuing basis, membership of some form of customs union, allowing the UK to be easily part of an EU or an EU type deal. Falling down to that 125 level, I mean, it obviously goes lower in the short term, down to around 120 on the basis of Q1 2019, maybe a no-deal scenario coming out and we don't get something and everything falls apart from there. To be honest, my expectation is a little bit lower than that sterling could fall even down to maybe 115 in sterling dollar terms if we get to March the 29th and we do not have a deal. That doesn't look likely at the moment, but as it stands at the moment, as I said, there's about a 20% differential between the high and the low outcome. There's a lot of volatility out there. As you can see in this graph as well, I've just put a highlight here of this 1 year expectation. This is based on options markets. This is based on markets that people use to hedge their currency risk. So in 1 year's time, when I did this presentation and wrote this up at the beginning of the week, on the 11th of September the 11th, 2019, the market is only pricing in an 80% chance that sterling will be against the US dollar between 115.5 and 149. Now, obviously, there's a 10% chance probably to the high side that it could be above 149 and 10% chance that it could be below 115. But in the grand scheme of things, no one has really any idea about where sterling dollar is going to be over the course of that time period. Obviously, the longer you go out, you can look at 2021 between 104 and 170. That's not going to help anyone doing any budgets anytime soon. 3 months between 122.5 and 130 and 138. The longer you go out, the more uncertainty there is likely to be. But we're looking to see whether there's going to be a change around March the 29th and whether the market's starting to price in chances of a fall off anytime soon. These graphs here look at the costs of hedging, the difference in hedging between two currencies. The red and the purple line is sterling versus the US dollar. A hedge for 6 months, a hedge for a year. The yellow and the kind of white line, which is quite difficult to see on my screens, I've just realized, is euro versus sterling over 6 months and 1 year. The teal and red line, sterling against the yen, and the blue and kind of goldy line, sterling against the Aussie dollar over the 6 month time frame. The lower the number, apart from when you're talking about euro sterling, is the people putting more of an emphasis on sterling downside. And unfortunately, anything below zero, it looks like sterling downside. So apart from euro sterling, where we'd have to say that the higher number means sterling downside, every hedge out there, apart from big emerging market risks like Turkey, South Africa, Brazil at the moment, for major exporting nations that the UK does business with, or obviously importing nations, major trading nations the UK does business with, the market is expecting over the course of the next 6 to 12 months that sterling will fall in value. So therefore, prices on hedges to protect yourself against sterling value are a little bit more expensive. We have lived through a fairly risky period, obviously, with the Brexit vote. And the timeline of risk shows that we have many hurdles to jump over. September is going to be a very, very busy month. We have the General Affairs Council on September the 18th and another informal European Council on the 20th before Parliament breaks and the Conservative Party conference takes place up in Birmingham. Rumour has it, obviously, that there will be some form of leadership challenge to Theresa May. I can't really see it there at the moment, and to be honest, depending on who it came from, a leadership challenge could either be sterling positive or sterling negative. Sterling positive if it came from someone who was seen as more Remainer than Theresa May, and obviously if people are talking up the chances of Boris Johnson or Jacob Rees-Mogg around a leadership challenge or a possible vote, I don't think they have the votes, but a possible vote, then sterling could look quite disconsolate on the basis of that. The one thing that we need to focus on is probably November. It looks like if we are going to have a deal pre-March 2019, it's likely to be struck in November and then sent out to the European Parliament to be voted upon. That could be a possible time where sterling starts to really run higher. End of October, beginning of November, as it looks more and more likely that the deal can be done, but no deal risk can be priced out of sterling, and we can move forward from there. It is unfortunately only on March the 29th that we will have some finality around this, and as people have said, nothing's agreed until everything's agreed. Everything has to be agreed by March the 29th, or kicked into the transitional period, and notes have to be made. Have to be made around that. There's still a huge amount of work that needs to be done, and this Parliament Brexit vote deadline, January the 21st, it needs to be done by then, and then any other changes can be made between then and March the 29th. So I always use the analogy of a basketball match when talking about these things. I don't know if anyone watches basketball, but to me it's always seemed like a kind of back and forth. One team scores, then the other team scores, then the team A scores, then team B scores, and it only really gets exciting with about 2 minutes to go, where it's panic, and then everyone scores, and then someone wins. And this is exactly what we think is going to happen with Brexit, that so far we're still in that kind of back and forth, everyone taking 2 points off each other kind of game, and eventually we're going to start getting to that frantic period at the end of the fourth period, where someone has to win, someone makes a mistake, and someone takes advantage of that. We're not getting to that yet, but one thing that will engender within sterling, unfortunately, is additional volatility. So let's have a quick look at our central scenario and the worst case. A deal will be done. Politicians are strange animals, but the one thing they do like is signing their name into the history books. So a deal will be done, despite what a lot of people will say. No deal is definitely worse than a bad deal for anyone who is an international facing business. We would hope to see the transitional deal extended. It currently runs out in December 2020, but I would put some money on who wants to have the other side of the bet, that by the 10th anniversary of the EU referendum votes on June the 23rd, 2026, that we will still be part of a transitional arrangement with the European Union, and still probably therefore members of the European Union as a whole. Theresa May, we also expect to be replaced as PM by a Brexiteer once the Article 50 period is over. What we hope doesn't happen is no deal, a leadership challenge from Boris at conference, and a recession/sterling crisis, which would likely happen were we to exit the EU on March the 29th without a deal, and therefore without a transitional arrangement as well. So, I don't know what that's doing there. What can international businesses do about this? Very, very briefly, as I'm sure everyone on this call will know, as soon as your business crosses a border, it takes on a currency risk. It takes on risks from currency, but it depends on what you are doing across that border, whether it's transactional, translational, credit, or liquidity. Your company can be exposed to one of these risks. We've talked about tax. You may have foreign tax obligations. You may have accounts payable. You may have capital expenditure to pay for a warehouse or warehousing elsewhere as a result of customs issues. You may have default risk. You may have liquidity that's needed for foreign purchases and sales as well. As soon as you have any of those in a foreign country, you're likely to involve some form of currency risk. You have to look at a long, medium, or short-term view. How far forward can you cover? How quickly, easily, and reliably can you forecast your exposure? Is it 3 months? Is it three weeks even? Is it 3 years? Hedging programs do go as far as 3 years. I've seen some as long as 5. And what are your hedging objectives as well? Do you want to be completely protected? Take your FD hat off and get on with the business of running that business, or would you like to play around, have a little bit more flexibility depending on new contracts being signed in that kind of area. Obviously, it depends on a great many things. The timing of contracts, when payments need to be made. Obviously, as well, cash flow for your business. If it's young and upcoming, that you need to make sure there's a certain amount of cash in the business to be able to make payroll. The last thing we want to do is put everything against the currency hedge and not be able to pay the employees at the end of the at the end of the month. The next 6 months are going to be a very, very interesting time for sterling. I've said that probably about every 6 month period throughout the Brexit timeline, but it's going to be a very, very volatile time. Currently, against the US dollar, sterling's about 130. You would have to say that in 6 months' time, sterling is definitely not going to be at 130. Why do I say that? Because in 6 months' time, we either have to have a deal, which is obviously positive, or we won't have a deal, and that's obviously negative. So it's going to go one way or the other. If you can afford a 10% fall off in the value of sterling, then fantastic. But why would you want to? If you're looking for a 5%, 6% uplift, then absolutely fantastic. Maybe only hedge half of your exposure. But these are the kind of times where hedging really, really starts to pay off for businesses because it takes some of that uncertainty, which is natural in this market, out of their accounts. So that is me. I've been waffling on for about 15 minutes. 15 minutes there. I will now open up the lines of Claire and Richard again. Hopefully, if any of you have been typing some questions into the bar, I will put them over to the relevant person. So for now, give me 2 seconds. Claire's back on and Richard's back on. So questions. First one here. One for you, Claire. By post-Brexit for VAT, what are the dates are we talking about? I guess when do we think that these VAT rates could be imposed?
The VAT rates for what are they specifically referring to? Does it clarify, Jeremy?
No, unfortunately not. It does seem to be there's seems to be the only question.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think that it just depends on what happens as you said, in the next 6 months, and whether we're going to have a hard Brexit. What I spoke about in my presentation, that will come into effect overnight, as I understand it. The import VAT implications as a non-EU country. We are crashing out if there is no transition period, so they will happen straight away. At the end of March.
Okay. Yeah. In fact, the panelist, the correspondents just clarified. I particularly mean dropping distance selling VAT.
Again, that will happen as we understand it. If there's a no Brexit deal, that will happen overnight. If there is a hard Brexit, we will be out of the EU, and they are EU specific regulations. So it really depends on the deal.
Okay, another question also for you here, Claire. Post-Brexit, so this is UK B2C, would you still need to declare sales into other EU countries?
No, this is the distance selling rules that the previous questioner just mentioned. So no, they would be non-EU sales, so they could be zero rated. As an export, but as they get imported into the EU to your private consumer, either the customer accounts for the VAT there, or you possibly might want to register in an EU country and account for the VAT.
Okay, wonderful. Richard, one for you here. Will my goods be subject to new customs rules, procedures and inspections at both the UK and EU borders in future? And could my shipments be held up and delayed for any reason?
Yes, I mean, obviously, if we're on a hard Brexit with no deal, goods will be stopped. And if people bear in mind, if they're only selling part loads, like 10 pallets, 8 pallets worth, not a full trailer, there'll be other goods on there. So again, that could delay because there's paperwork checks. And again, when it goes over to the border over in France, again, there'll be checks again. That's what we believe. So there'll be 2 different checks And obviously for the imports coming in, it'll be the same scenario. So yes, I'm absolutely certain there'll be delays unless we can do it electronically. And I'm not sure they're quite ready for that yet, to be honest.
Fair enough. Fair enough. A question for me. What do we think on the prospect of further interest rate rises from the Bank of England over the course of the next year, depending on Brexit? It's really interesting. Well, actually, we've got a Bank of England meeting today, which we don't think they're going to raise interest rates at. Obviously, they did one back in August. They have said something about interest rate rises being gradual and limited, to which our understanding means one every 6 months. So 6 months from now is basically Brexit. It's March the 29th. They tend to do these things around either March, June, August, or November. These are the quarterly inflation reports. And to be honest, I think they'll hold off post-March the 29th to make sure all the ducks in a row, and we won't see another interest rate rise until June. If everything goes to hell in a handcart, and we don't have a deal, then I would expect one of two things. We could either see inflation obviously skyrocket as the pound falls, and the Bank of England try to boost the pound by raising interest rates. That's one scenario, or obviously, as I think was more likely, especially with Mark Carney still at the helm, interest rate cuts to try and generate some spending. Let's have a look. This one's going to be one for you, Richard. What will the impact be of declaring UK origin of goods rather than EU origin? How can you mitigate the potential supply chain impact of this?
It's a difficult one because if you can bear in mind, we were looking at one of the Brexits about this, about most people who export UK origin goods have imported most of the products in from other countries. So you have the scenario that if you bear in mind something like Land Rover or Jaguar, they'll import from the EU on one particular product. I remember the air conditioning unit. On the one particular air conditioning that goes into the cars, the Discovery, I think it was, 26 different consignments coming in from the EU. So you've got the UK origins which are put on into the plant, and you've also got different origins coming in. It's all the implications of how do you bring the goods in, because obviously you've got to clear them. There's an extra cost to the production. If you UK origin, are you bringing it from China and then finishing the goods and then making it a UK origin? Obviously, you will have the implications of when you sell to the EU, depending if it's a hard Brexit. Obviously, you'll have to and you'll have customs and possible delays there. If it's EU, maybe you could send the goods directly into the EU and have some, which Claire mentioned before about the fiscal representation, which I know a few customers are doing that at the moment. So maybe rather than, it's not ideal, but if I'm being perfectly honest, on some of the workshops, probably 10% of the customers have actually already got fiscal representation in Europe as a safeguard. So they'll, instead of bringing into the UK, they'll bring straight into Europe and then deal in the EU through that nominated country.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Richard. Last question that we have here, I think, is one for me. Are the Bank of England thinking house prices will fall? I get this question more often than you can possibly imagine. I'm also in the process of buying a house myself, but it depends on where you're looking. In central London, certainly, house prices have been on a negative trend for about 2 years now. In outer parts of London, the southeast, we're seeing anywhere between falls and kind of stagnation. And elsewhere around the UK, things are either stagnant to very, very small increases. We're talking kind of 1 to 2% over the course of the next couple of years. To be honest, everything's kind of set fair at the moment, especially if we do get a deal, to have some form of price stagnation in the housing market. Supply is still starting to come on stream. The Help to Buy scheme has allowed a lot of people to be able to go out and buy houses, first-time buyers to be able to go buy houses, but the slight falls that we've seen in house prices, or the stagnation that we've seen in house prices since then, mean that their ability to trade up quickly from a 1 or 2 bed flat starter house bought under Help to Buy and then move somewhere else means that they have to pay back that Help to Buy scheme to the government, which they obviously don't have, and therefore they're kind of locked in. So we're seeing a little bit of stagnation between the tiers in the housing market, and that's obviously going to slow down A, people moving, and therefore B, you'd have to say prices as well. Okay, that's the last of the questions that I have on my little chart sheet on the right hand side of my screen. So if you've got any last questions, feel free to pop them in the box, and I'll be more than happy to answer them. We've got a couple of minutes before the webinar is due to end. I can see, of course, that the numbers are starting to dwindle as well, so maybe people are taking their leave already. But I'll give the last. Quickly, there's one question for Claire that's just coming through. I can see the person is typing ferociously, so I'll give them a couple of minutes just to pop their thoughts. In light of the proposed changes, it's going to come through like a kind of telegram, I feel.
Modern technology.
Exactly. In light of the proposed changes, would Simply VAT's VAT module still be relevant as CPD? That's the question.
Yeah, they would be. They are relevant. I mean, the EU VAT rules are explained, and they are still going to be relevant in the EU. And of course, once we actually know what the deal of leaving the EU looks like, we will update those modules. So they should definitely count towards your professional development CPD points.
Excellent. Well, then it just leaves me to say thank you very much to Claire and Richard, our panelists, and thank you for everyone for taking the time out of their day to join the presentation and listen to what we think about obviously about customs and tax. And the pound moving forward. This webinar has been recorded. You will be sent a link out so you can view the recording again, or obviously pass it on to a colleague or someone who you may find or may think that this is interesting for. And obviously we'll circulate our email addresses as well if you have any other questions that pop up in the middle of the night as a result of what exactly is going on. So it just leaves me to say thanks. It does happen, especially when you're talking about Brexit.
Exactly.
So thank you very much to everyone involved. It's been great to talk to you. As I said, thanks very much to Claire and to Richard for taking the time, and I look forward to seeing all of you on a webinar or at a meeting in the very near future. Take care.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Claire.